Hello everybody, and welcome to my final installment of my Theros Beyond Death set review. Today we're going to be covering the gold cards and the colorless cards in the set. If you missed any of my previous set reviews, you can find them on my YouTube channel. They are all uploaded. But before I dive into this one, I want to remind you that if you enjoyed the video, be sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future uploads, and leave a comment in the comment section down below if you have any questions or feedback about my reviews. Before we start talking about the cards, I do want to mention my grading scale. It's on an A through F scale. The A's are the best cards in the set. They're the bombs, or the cards you're most hoping to open when you sit down at the table. B's actively pull you into the color. They are some of the most powerful cards in your deck, and they're the cards you're going to be looking to take early on in packs. C's are solid playables. They're archetype staples. They're cards that you play a good number of in every limited deck, but you're never too happy to have them you're never too unhappy to be playing them. D's are the cards that you are a little bit unhappy to be playing. They're filler. They're below average cards. A lot of the time you'll have them as your 22nd, 23rd card in your limited deck, but they are not high priorities, and they're cards that you'll probably end up with a couple in a lot of decks, though the best decks won't have any. F's are straight up unplayable. There are also cards that get a special sideboard grade because they're only good coming out of the sideboard, but out of the sideboard they do some pretty decent work. And then there's build-around cards that need a little bit of extra work, but if you put that work in, they can definitely deliver. We're going to be going through now all of the cards based on set number. For the other cards, I went commons, uncommons, rares, but since there aren't any common multicolor cards, it just was easier to go through by set number. So starting things off, we have Acolyte of Affliction. Acolyte of Affliction is just a B-level card. It gets you a lot of value when it comes into play, can even find something extra, so you can play this when you have a target already, and you can potentially mill something even better. I think this card is just going to be a pretty good card to be playing, pretty easy to splash, especially if you are a base green deck. I could totally see this being splashed in a blue-green deck very easily. I think Acolyte of Affliction is quite powerful. Next is Allure of the Unknown. This card's really hard to evaluate. It actually gets worse depending on how good the best card in your deck is, because if you have a really good card in your deck that your opponent might be able to get for free, you're not really going to want Allure of the Unknown. But if you have a deck that is basically all C's, Allure of the Unknown gets a lot better. One thing to note is that the way this card works is that the opponent has to cast the card immediately. They can't like save the card and use it whenever, which is definitely a relevant piece of text. They can't just save a removal spell forever. They have to use it immediately. So it's like you draw 5 cards and they get to cast one of the cards for free. So it's like a pretty good amount of card advantage, but I think it's really going to be deck dependent which decks want this card. Next is Ashiok Nightmare Muse. I have this card as a solid A. This card is fantastic. If you ever play this on even a medium board, you're very quickly going to pull ahead and defeat your opponent. Planeswalkers and Limited are generally quite good, and especially the ones that make creature tokens, and I think this card is going to be a fantastic addition. The plus ability is very good, making a 2/3 every turn. The minus ability can just make sure your opponent can't really attack profitably into Ashiok, and then the ultimate ability is obviously quite strong. Next is Atrus, Oracle of Half-Truths. I have this as a solid B as well. It's a little bit less easy to splash because green isn't part of it, but this card is still quite good. 4 mana, 3/2 menace that gets you to let you draw either 1 or 2 cards when it comes into play, and fuels your graveyard. The cards that you don't draw go to the graveyard is quite nice. So even if you ever flip an escape card off this, it's going to feel quite good. I love the little sub game it creates because your opponent can maybe like reveal a medium card and put your good card face down. But yeah, 4 mana, 3/2 that potentially draws you 2 cards or draws you a very good spell is definitely going to be a B-level card. Next is Bronzehideline. This is also a B. A lot of the rares are B-level cards in this set. It's quite powerful. 2 mana, 3/3 is already like very above rate. The fact that it can gain indestructible until end of turn is also fantastic. It's a great card to suit up with enchantments, use fight spells with, because it's going to be really like hard to deal with in combat situations. And then the fact that it has even more upside coming back out of the graveyard to protect other creatures is quite good as well. I also love the flavor of this card. It's like the lion that Hercules killed, and then he used its skin as like armor essentially. So Bronzehideline, A+ on flavor, B in terms of playability, and it is definitely a great card. Next is Calyx, Destiny's Hint, another B. The Planeswalker and Limited thing does still apply here. It's not as powerful as Ashiok because it doesn't make tokens, but if you build your deck around Calyx, you're definitely going to be rewarded for it. Looking at the top 4 means that you're relatively likely to hit an enchantment. If you have 10 enchantments in your deck, that on average you're going to hit one if you look at the top 4, which is not too hard to do. And then the -3 ability is essentially going to be removal. You're going to hopefully have a non-creature enchantment on the battlefield when you use this, so you don't want to be exiling creatures your opponent controls underneath creatures you have, because then they get a ton of value when they kill your creature. But if you have something like a Banishing Light, maybe a enchantment that helps you draw extra cards or things like that, it's going to be pretty effective, and I think Calyx is going to be quite nice. And then the -7 is actually very potent as well, but it won't come up very often. Next is Dalek's Crafters of Wonders. This is just a D+. There's not a ton of artifacts in the set. The equipped ability doesn't really matter at all, but sometimes you can play a 3-mana 2/4, so it's like a D or a D. Like it's a D. It's like a D+ level card if you're in a blue-red deck, because a 3-mana 2/4 is like okay stats. Next is Devourer of Memory. This card is a, I think, C+ level card. Blue-black for just a 2/1 isn't great, but the ability is definitely nice, though it is expensive. It's really going to all depend on, first of all, how aggressive blue-black is. If blue-black ends up being a tempo deck, then this ability definitely gains a lot of value, and because the damage becomes more relevant. But that's kind of hard to combine with also milling. One thing to keep in note is that you can pump this twice. So like if you do the ability one time, it'll get +1/+1, and then you can pay another 3 mana to get +1/+1 again. So keep that in mind when you are attacking with this. In the late game, you could maybe attack for 4 damage. It doesn't trigger for multiple cards though. So if I use the ability twice, I've got 2 different instances of the trigger. So the way it works is it'll become a 4/3, but if I mill 2 cards from one independent effect, it won't actually work that way, so it'll only trigger once. But yeah, that's just something to keep in mind, a little bit of bonus tip for the card. Next is Dream Trawler. I have this as a solid A-. The only reason it's an A- instead of an A is because white, blue is a little bit of a restrictive mana cost, which makes it so you can't really splash this card ever, though this card is fantastic if you are playing blue-white, and I would really heavily try to play blue-white if you have this card. It's basically impossible to race, gets you card advantage, it's really hard to kill. You can activate the ability of discarding a card to give it hexproof, even if it is already tapped. So that means that it's almost impossible to deal with in combat, and it has lifelink, so it's really scary. So Dream Trawler is a solid A-, and it's really an A if you're in a blue-white deck, or even an A+ in those decks. Though A+ is a little bit steep because it is 6 mana, but yeah, I think it's A- for sure. Next is Enigmatic Incarnation. I have this as just an F. It's too hard to build around, and it just doesn't really do enough stuff in limited. You're not going to be able to use this to get a card's worth of value or 4 mana's worth of value, so I just don't think it's worth it. Atropia Twice Favored is one of the best. I think it's the best uncommon for blue-green in the set. It's just a fantastic card. It's also, like, of the cycle of uncommons, I think this is probably the best one of the gold uncommons, just because it's such a brutal ability. You can target itself with its own ability, and also just giving your like 3/3s or your 4/4s +1/+1 and counters and flying is just really powerful. I think this card is fantastic. It's a solid B, maybe even up to B+. That might be a little bit ambitious, but definitely a great card. Next is Galley of the Endless Dance. I have this as a B-. It's just like pretty effective card. There's some satyrs in the set, especially the 1/1 tokens. Making those into 2/2s, doubling their power is quite nice, and the ability will come up from time to time. Overall, I think this card is just a pretty solid pull to red-green, and I think it's just a pretty powerful card. Next is Hacked Osteons card. I have this at a B+. It just seems so irritating to deal with, because if the number, especially if the number is like something like 4, there's a lot of 2-drops that this might trade for. But if the number's 4, it's going to have to trade with a 4-drop, and then if you have any way to interact with their 4-drops, which they're naturally going to have less of in their deck, it's going to be really hard to deal with. So it's got like a pretty decent chance of being 3 or 4, and those cases are just very difficult to block. So I think this card's going to be irritating, almost impossible to race, and if you can combine it with combat tricks, it's going to be even scarier. So I think Haktos is fantastic. Next is Hero of the Nyx, but you do have to be aggressive for Haktos to be good. You don't even have to be that aggressive. You can just be like a mid-range deck or something like that, or you can use it as your control deck finisher. It's just a great card. Next is Hero of the Nyxborn. I have this as a solid B as well. It's also one of the better uncommons from the uncommon cycle. All those uncommons are pretty solid, but I think Hero and Utopia are both very nice. Hero of the Nyxborn pretty much does everything red-white wants to do. It helps you go wide. It gives you that pseudo-heroic trigger. And I think this card is going to be a solid B. Clothis, God of Destiny, is the next card. I think this card is probably a B, but the lower end of the B spectrum. It's really hard to get. I'm not sure how easy it is to get 7 Devotion in red and green. It's probably relatively easy. Actually, this card's just a straight-up B. It's very good. The more I think about it, the more I realize it's a little bit easier to get Devotion for red-green than I was thinking, because this gives 2 of the Devotion itself, so you just need 5 other mana symbols, which means you need like 3 creatures, which is not that hard to do. And then you have a 4/5 indestructible, which is just great. And its trigger is quite relevant as well, adding mana and dealing some damage to the opponent, and also messing up their escape. So I think Klothys is going to be a solid B. And yeah. Next is Crocs, Titan of Death's Hunger. I have this at B+ at the moment. It does the 3 damage to your opponent even if they don't discard a card. So even if they're empty-handed, it does an extra 3 damage to them. You do want to have ways to fuel your graveyard, but black definitely has ways of self-milling, and bringing back Crocs is going to be fantastic. Even if you do this later in the game, a 4-mana 6/6 with this ability, even if it requires some work, is going to be... I think it's a build-around. You can't just slot this into any red-black deck and have it be great, but even in those decks, it'll still be okay as just a 2-mana, like 6/6. And I'm pretty sure you can respond to the sacrifice trigger by sacrificing it to something else. I'm not 100% sure on that. It's a little bit of a tricky interaction, but I think you might be able to do that as well, so you can get a little extra value from that. And bringing it back from the graveyard, 5 cards is a lot, but if you build your deck around it a little bit, it shouldn't be impossible. So I think this card's going to be a B+ level card when you do the right work to support it. Next is Kuno's Hound of Atrus. I think this card is either a B+ or a B. It's very good. It has a ton of relevant abilities. Menace and lifelink and vigilance mean that it'll be good on both sides, offense and defense. And if you ever put an enchantment aura on it, those abilities work really well with auras. So keep that in mind when you have this. It also works really well against escape. So I think it's going to be a B, but it's definitely going to be a very powerful card in the set. Next is Mischievous Chimera. This is the lower end of the B spectrum, but I still think it's a B, or maybe it's a B- on a bad day. But a 2-mana 2/2 flyer is really good. It's also an enchantment creature, and you're going to get incidental value in your blue-red decks just from naturally casting spells on your opponent's turn, like removal. And if you have a really good version of the deck, you're probably going to be doing that a lot. So I think Mischievous Chimera is probably just a B. Next is Pulukronos Unchained. This card is fantastic. I have this as a solid A. A 4-mana 6/6, even though it'll slowly get smaller over time, is still just a fantastic card. You can use it as a removal spell. You can also exile 6 other cards to escape it. You can even splash this card in a green deck. I think this card, all in all, is going to be fantastic. I'm actually going to... It could just be an A+ level card. Very good, very powerful, and really the type of card you're hoping to open, you're hoping to splash. Like, making a 12/12 for 6 mana is just a disgusting amount of power, and you'll definitely want to build your deck to enable the exile 6 other cards. But if you have like a self-mill deck, you're going to be able to mill this card over and cast it more often than other cards, because all of your mill cards are essentially drawing you 3. Like, if you play a card that mills you 3, it's like milling you 3 cards closer to finding your Pulukronos. So I think this card's going to be fantastic, and definitely an A or A+. I'm just going to give it an A+. This is like one, like, relative to other cards in the set, this is like one of the ones that if you open this card, you're going to be like, yep, we did it. Next is Rise to Glory. This card is a C+ in my opinion. It's a little bit hard to build around, but once you do get there, it does have a little bit of extra upside. It's like a draw 2 that puts them both on the battlefield, which is quite nice. If this was just creature or aura, it wouldn't be quite powerful enough, but the fact that it can get you both is quite nice. So getting back like a Mire's Grasp or I think something Apathy is the white Luminous Bonds type effect, pacifism effect. But yeah, Rise to Glory is definitely a C+ level card, and one that if you build around can even get up to a B- potentially. Next is Seonah, Captain the Prerelease. I have this as a B- if you have a couple of enchantments in your deck. You don't need a couple of auras in your deck. You don't need all that many auras for this card to become good, but you really want to be trying to draw that extra card. If you can draw the card like even a little bit over half the time, this card is going to be pretty good. So it's a C+ to B- depending on how many auras you have in your deck, which green-white does not struggle to get, especially because green-white has some auras that function as removal. Next is Slaughter Priest of Mogens. I have this as a C+. It's a pretty nice payoff for the black-red sacrifice deck. It's not a great sacrifice outlet in itself because 2 mana is a little bit steep, but there are a lot of great sacrifice outlets, and it does get +2/+0 even if you sacrifice things to other outlets. It doesn't get the first strike, but it still does get that +2/+0, and being able to sacrifice things itself means you have a pretty good threat of activation, so you can attack with this, and it can sacrifice enchantments, which is really nice, especially with the omens. Next is Staggering Inside. I have this as a B. It's going to be so irritating when your opponent plays like a 2-mana flyer and then just puts Staggering Inside on it and starts hitting you with it. It's pretty difficult to race, pretty difficult to outvalue. It can get punished, but I think that it's offset by the amount of power, and even if they hit you with it only once, it's still card even, so I think this card is fantastic. Next is Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath. I also have this as a build around B+. It isn't in black, and black has a decent amount of the self-mill in the set, but it does overlap into green a little bit, and green has some self-mill as well. And if you ever get this into play and attack with it once, you've just like really done it. And even as just a 3-mana play to draw a card, gain 3 life, and put a land, that's like okay. and I think this card is going to be fantastic. It's definitely a B+. Next is Warden of the Chained. I have this as a B, 3 mana 4/4 trample. Even though it can't attack unless you have another big creature, there are a pretty decent amount of big creatures running around, and it can already block. So it'll be a pretty nice brick wall if you're playing an aggressive mirror, and then it'll attack really well. And it has trample, which is really nice upside. Next is Altar of the Pantheon. We're moving on to the colorless cards. I think this card is just going to probably be a pretty typical D+ level card. You don't really play this unless you're trying to splash, but if you are trying to splash, this card does do pretty good work, so you'll take it a little bit higher in those cases. Next is Bronze Sword. I have this card as just a straight up F. 3 mana to equip for not even buffing the toughness at all is just not playable. Entrancing Lyre I have as a C+. It's colorless, so you'll take it pretty early and be pretty happy with it. It's not super efficient, but it is very flexible. You can lock down any threat permanently, and then if they play something better, you can choose to let that other creature free and then lock down the bigger one. So Entrancing Lyre is going to play out pretty well. It might even be a B-, especially early in the draft because it's colorless and pretty much always going to make your deck. One other trick you can use with Entrancing Lyre is if you're an aggressive deck, you can tap down a creature, and then on your upkeep, you can untap the Entrancing Lyre, untap something else down with it, and then both creatures will be tapped so you can attack your opponent. Next is Mirror Shield. I have this card as kind of a build around C, because if you're playing a deck where you're trying to go big on auras, I don't think Mirror Shield is the only card you would want to have, but if you have a Mirror Shield, you can equip that to a creature on turn 4. So you play your 3-drop, Mirror Shield, equip, you now have a hexproof creature that you can just load auras onto, which is really nice. I will say that this card is not going to be great in most decks because most decks can't afford to go deep on the aura plan, but if you have a couple of ways to protect your creatures from auras, maybe the combat trick that give hexproof, those could be useful. The Mirror Shield could slot into that type of deck, and so I think it's a build around C, but you're not really going to put this into most other decks. Next is Nyx Lotus. I have this card as not very good in limited at all. By the time you have 4 mana, you don't really want to be spending it to get even more mana because like the most expensive card you're casting limited is 6 anyway, so ramping from 4 to 6 is not super great, and it's really difficult to necessarily even have a ton of devotion by turn 4 anyway, and later on in the game it's basically complete blank. So I have this as like a D- or a very situational card that maybe some decks would play. Next is Shadow Spear. I have this as a B-. The fact that it gives trample and lifelink makes it really good on offense, especially with bigger creatures because you're getting massive life swings. The reason it's not a little bit higher is because if you don't have any beefy creatures already, it does get a little bit worse, and if your opponent doesn't really care about beating you down, the lifelink becomes a lot less relevant, and then you only giving +1/+1 for 3 mana, which is just not super great. Next is Soul Guide Lantern. I actually have this as just a playable card in the main deck. I think it's probably a C in the main deck, or you can side it in the right matchup. You can do either one, but if your deck's short on playables, slotting in a Soul Guide Lantern is never going to be too bad because you can probably find the 2 mana across turns to just play it and then exile it. It fuels your own escape cards, and while simultaneously hurting your opponents, which is just a solid little card to be putting in your main deck and relatively low cost. But out of the sideboard, it does get a little bit better because you know that there will be good targets to exile. So if you are bringing this out of the board, maybe you just consider not playing it immediately and waiting until your opponent mills something relevant to exile. Next is Thaumaturge is familiar. I think just based on the stats and the Scry one, it's probably just a D+ level card. Just not a super big body. 3 mana, 1/3 flyer is just not great. And you'll put this in your deck sometimes, but you won't be super happy when you do. Thundering Chariot is the only vehicle in the set, and I think it's pretty good. Vehicles tend to play out pretty well. They dodge enchantment speed removal generally, and unless you're using them to block, and if your opponent uses enchantment removal on it, so be it. But when they're attacking, they're really hard to deal with normal removal. They have to be killed by instant speed removal, and the fact that this has first strike makes it kind of difficult to block. One thing of note is that it doesn't wear auras at all. You put the aura on it, and then the aura will fall off at the end of the turn, which is a little bit sad because giving an aura to a first strike creature is quite nice. But Thundering Chariot is still going to be probably a C or a C+. The vehicles tend to play out a little bit better than they look, so I'd probably normally give this a C, but it's really easy to crew, so maybe this is a C+. And it's colorless, so pretty easy to get these into your deck. Next is Traveler's Amulet. This is just a pretty nice card for fixing your deck. I think it's a D+. You're not going to want to play this if you're just a 2-color deck, but if you are looking to splash, this is a pretty nice way to do so, and can sometimes be used, especially in an escape deck, to like fuel your graveyard a little bit while you're splashing, so I think it's just a D+. Next is Wings of Hubris. This is a Cobbled Wings variant. This is going to be very format dependent, but sometimes these cards play out way better than they look because just giving your big creatures flying can be really relevant. There's not a ton of flying in the set, so giving your creature flying is almost like as good as giving it unblockable in a lot of matchups. So giving your like big beefy creatures like your 4/3s and your 5/5s unblockable could be quite nice. So I think Wings of Hubris is either a pretty potent sideboard card in the right matchup, or just like a D+ in the main deck in certain decks. We've got onto the lands. Field of Ruin is just an F in limited. They're not gonna have enough non-basic lands for this to ever be worth it. So just don't play Field of Ruin. Labyrinth of Scum, I think, is actually quite powerful. I think it's a C+ as a land because it is a pretty significant mana cost. So you're not going to be able to hold this up all the time in limited, and it is colorless, so that's a real cost. But consider playing this as like an 18th land potentially because it does have a pretty spell-like effect. It makes double blocking very difficult for your opponent. They have to oftentimes triple block, and then they are forced to make suboptimal blocks. So I think Labyrinth of Scum is going to be like a C+, but keep in mind you do have to like make sure that you don't overvalue it because there isn't going to be like infinite times where you get to activate this in a game. Moving on to the temples, all the temples are roughly the same. I just wanted to show them all so you know what they look like, but they're all going to be C+ level cards. Temple of Abandon, Temple of Deceit, Temple of Enlightenment, Temple of Malice, and Temple of Plenty. They all are just above average. You'll take them over the commons that are just pretty average for your deck, and keep in mind you can just play these in your deck that is one of the colors. So if you are a blue-green deck, you can still play a Temple of Plenty to get that extra scry value on your land, and since it's replacing a land slot instead of one of your creatures, you're getting a little bit of extra value for your mana base compared to your opponent, which is a nice little advantage. So you'll take these over average playables for sure, but not over the premium commons. That is going to do it. There's one more card. Unknown Shores. Don't play Unknown Shores. Pretty much, if you're going to be using this, you never play this in a 2-color deck because you don't want to ever you don't want to add one to the cost of your spells. That just makes them not worth it. And then if you are going to be splashing, try to find a Traveler's Amulet. Try to find an Altar of the Pantheon. Try to be a green deck that can use some of the fixing in green. Unknown Shores is just so bad. I think it's a D-. You can sometimes play it, but it's just really not worth it. I would highly recommend against it. If you are splashing, just play a basic of the splash color instead of Unknown Shores, because adding a cost to your spells in your main color is just so bad, and you're going to be, if you have a basic of a different color, you're basically doing that anyway. So Unknown Shores, D-. I want to just give it an F though, because you really should never be playing this card. That is going to do it for the gold and colorless set review. I do hope you enjoyed it. If you did, be sure to check out my other set reviews for the set. I've gone through all 5 colors and gone through all of the cards in the set. So if you want to get my particular opinions, you can check those out. Remember to like, subscribe, and comment if you have any questions or feedback. And in the comments, leave a hashtag gold review if you did make it all the way to the end to let me know you made it to the end of the video. That is going to do it. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time.